What if the place where your life seemed to end was actually the place where God began your greatest story? This is the incredible story of Joseph. Joseph was the beloved son of Jacob, but his brothers saw something they could never accept. Their father loved him more. Then Joseph began having dreams. Dreams that seemed impossible. His family would one day bow before him, and that made his brothers furious. One night, Joseph dreamed again. This time, he saw 11 stars, along with the sun and moon, bowing before him. But his brothers didn't see a prophecy. They saw a threat, and jealousy turned into hatred. One day, when Joseph came looking for his brothers, they made a decision that would change his life forever. They grabbed him, stripped him of his special coat, and threw him into a pit. Joseph cried for help, but no one came. Then, from the bottom of that pit, Joseph watched his own brothers sell him as a slave. Imagine that. The people who should have protected him were the ones who betrayed him. Joseph was taken far from home, far from his father, and far from everything he knew. But there was one thing his brothers could never take from him: God's purpose. Joseph arrived in Egypt as a slave. His freedom was gone. His family was gone. His dreams seemed impossible. But God was still with Joseph. Joseph eventually found favor in the house of Potiphar. Everything he touched seemed to prosper. But just when his life began to improve, another storm was coming. Joseph was falsely accused of doing something he never did, and without a fair chance to defend himself, he was thrown into prison. Again, Joseph went from the pit to slavery, and now to a prison cell. But here's the part you need to remember. Joseph was in prison, but God's plan for Joseph was not imprisoned. Even behind those walls, God was preparing him for something greater. Inside the prison, Joseph met two men who served Pharaoh. Both had troubling dreams, and Joseph had something they desperately needed: the ability to understand them. Joseph interpreted their dreams. One would be restored, the other would not survive. And Joseph asked only one thing: "Remember me." But when the man was released, he forgot Joseph. Days became months. Months became years. Joseph remained in prison, forgotten by men, but never forgotten by God. Then suddenly, Pharaoh had a dream. No one in Egypt could explain it. And then the forgotten prisoner was remembered: Joseph. The man who had been overlooked was suddenly summoned before Pharaoh. Joseph stood before the most powerful ruler in Egypt, but he didn't take the glory for himself. He said, in essence, "I cannot do it, but God can." And then Joseph revealed the meaning of Pharaoh's dream. 7 years of incredible abundance were coming, followed by 7 years of devastating famine. Egypt needed a plan, and Joseph had one. Pharaoh saw something extraordinary in Joseph. The prisoner became a leader, the slave became a ruler, and the man who had been forgotten was placed second only to Pharaoh. Then the famine came, and people from everywhere traveled to Egypt for food. Even Joseph's brothers came. The very men who had sold him were now standing before him, and they didn't recognize him. But Joseph recognized them, and the story was about to reach its most emotional moment. The brothers stood before Joseph, not knowing that the powerful ruler of Egypt was the brother they had betrayed years ago. Joseph could no longer hold back his emotions. He wept, and finally said, "I am Joseph. Is my father still alive?" His brothers were terrified, but Joseph did not seek revenge. Instead, he told them, "Do not be afraid. You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good." The brother they had sold was now the one who could save them, and Joseph forgave them. Joseph brought his father Jacob and his entire family to Egypt. What began with betrayal ended with restoration. What looked like the end of Joseph's story was actually the beginning of God's greater plan. Joseph had been rejected, betrayed, sold as a slave, and forgotten in prison. But God never forgot him. And through every trial, God was preparing him for his purpose. Sometimes, what feels like a setback is actually God preparing you for something greater. Trust God's plan, even when you cannot see the ending. Because just like Joseph, your story is not over yet.